because of the time difference between the US and the UK, it's only 4 hours at the moment, and the rest of Europe and other countries, the US is slightly out of sync. So hopefully we'll get a few more participants. But if there's anyone that you know should be coming and hasn't joined, please just remind them. This is the only week that this should happen, unfortunately, but here we are. Today is the second of our sessions in the Religions, Humanitarianism and Development reading group. This is our virtual reading group, which is now very much in line with the times. I hope that we'll be able to continue month to month as we go on through the rest of the year. Just a reminder that there's the ability for you to sign up to speak or to respond on these sessions, and Rima will put the link for the chat in a minute. Otherwise, I'll ask you to mute as you come into the room so that we can hear the speakers. Today we are welcome Professor Emma Tomalin, who is professor at the University of Leeds. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with her work already. She'll be presenting on her new paper. I think that this has been circulated to the group, so I hope you've had a chance to read it, but there's also not a requirement to have read it, and Emma will be presenting on the paper shortly. And then we're also very happy to have Kathleen Rutledge, who is a PhD candidate at Queen Margaret's University in Edinburgh, responding to Emma's paper. So just a reminder that we're going to have Emma's presentation, the response from Kathleen, and then we'll be handing over to general question and answers on the paper, and also we'll have a little bit of free time for you to bring up any conversation or opportunities or points of discussion more generally that you'd like to discuss too. Emma, I am going to share my screen so that you can see your PowerPoint, and we're ready to turn over to you. Emma, I think you're muted at the moment.
Hi everyone. Sorry, this is just taken up my whole screen now, which is not what I need, because I have some notes that I need to look out on my screen as well. I'm just trying to find a way of minimizing my screen.
If you press escape, you can minimize.
I've got it now. Yeah, it's just done it. Olivia, how long do it? So I've prepared something about 15-20 minutes. Is that too long?
20 minutes, that's fine.
Okay, how long is Kathleen going to feed back for? I'm just sort of getting an idea of how much time we'll have.
About 5 to 10, yes.
Okay, brilliant. All right, okay. So can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I see some nodding there. Okay, so so this is a paper that I first wrote and presented for the International Studies Association conference in Toronto. It's a conference I'd never been to before. And it was for a special issue of the journal International Affairs, and the special issue is entitled Engaging Religions and Religious Studies in International Affairs. So it's a Chatham House journal on international relations, and it's just come out actually. So just as Olivia asked me if I would do this, I literally just heard that this had come out online. So you can go and have a look at the rest of the articles as well. So it's in international affairs. So I guess the audience is a little bit different to the audience I normally write for. I had in mind an audience that would not necessarily have been familiar with the religion development domain, all the shifts and the changes and the concerns of this field. So the paper is called Global Aid and Faith Actors, the case for an actor-oriented approach to the turn to religion. Can I go to the first slide, please? Okay, so So in this paper that you've all had, I make the case for an actor-oriented approach, and this is building on the work of Norman Long, the development sociologist, to understanding faith actors' experience of the turn to religion by the global aid business over the past couple of decades. I argue that analysis of this turn to religion that's been offered by academics and practitioners has become bifurcated, with many viewing the turn to religion either as proof of the emergence of what we might call post-secular partnerships, while other takes it as testament that the international aid business instrumentalizes faith actors to achieve its own goals. So I think these two discourses are very prominent in responses to the turn to religion. So Haynes, for instance, calls today's international environment post-secular. Ager and Ager say that we are living in a post-secular age, and Cloak and his colleagues talk about post-secular partnerships. And with respect to the international aid business instrumentalizing faith actors, as Karam has written, some have voiced their unease that this interest in religion may be another passing fad that seeks to capitalize on their strengths and even attempt to change their way of doing things, almost as if a covert attempt were at hand to secularize the religious. So what I do in this paper is I argue that neither analysis adequately captures faith actors' experience themselves, so their own experience of the religion, development, humanitarian nexus. So first I argue that the idea of the post-secular, however we might want to define it, and there are lots of different ways of defining it and thinking about what it means, is a misleading term that obscures the way that faith actors who engage with the international system have to modify their language and mission and reshape themselves as ostensibly secular organisations in these interactions. Although global development and humanitarian institutions are taking religion more seriously, they predominantly and selectively partner with faith actors that are already visible and functional at the international level. As the anthropologist of development Olivia de Sardin writes, these actors have mastery of the development language, which is their ticket for entry into an international network, access to the developmentalist configuration, and therefore to the promise of funds and projects. And this, I think, very much leads to an assumption by the global development and humanitarian sphere that they've ticked the religion box because they're working with international faith-based organisations. So they work with these in multiple countries, and these are connected to the global aid system. But what they're missing out is the great diversity of so-called local faith actors who don't have this mastery of the development language, but who are closest to communities in need. But to quote again, have not yet acquired the language spoken in the world of development and are most marginalised from mainstream development and humanitarian partnerships. So that's the argument against the idea of post-secular partnerships. Second, I make the case that there's insufficient evidence to suggest that faith actors are simply passive targets for global development discourses and policies. In order to make sense of all of this, I apply the actor-oriented approach of the development sociologist Norman Long. Long views development arenas as social locations or situations in which contests over issues, resources, values, and representations take place. He proposes what he calls an actor-oriented interface analysis for understanding cultural diversity, social difference, and conflict inherent in processes of development intervention. The specific development that I focus on in the paper is that of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And within this, I will apply the actor-oriented interface analysis to understand the role played by international faith-based organisations in particular in this domain from their perspective. So this is all about looking at these interactions from the perspective of particular development actors. Alongside adopting an actor-oriented interface analysis, it's a very wordy idea, but quite simple really in application. I build on the work of Craft and Smith. This is Katie Craft and Jonathan Smith, who I think were the first to really point this out in their article. They draw attention to the crucial role that faith-based organisations play in acting as intermediaries between international donors and local faith communities. I mean, this is something that people working in the field know, but this is formalising it, putting it on the paper and relating it to existing academic analytical frameworks and theories. I extend their analysis by locating it within the literature on development brokers and translators, advanced by anthropologists of development in the early 2000s, so including, for instance, Lewis and Moss, Olivia de Sardin and Vierschenk. despite the relevance of this body of literature on brokers and translators to understanding the role that development actors play in the broader development sphere, the role that FBOs play as intermediaries and brokers has not yet been widely adopted to establish an analytical framework for interpreting the turn to religion. And this analysis of looking at brokers and translators allows me to articulate the distinctive role that many members of faith-based organisations report that they have as intermediaries who shift register between the interface of secular development language on the one hand and the faith-inspired language of their local faith partners on the other. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals are a particularly good vehicle for exploring the localisation of a global framework and the role that development intermediaries and brokers play in this. So in addition to Norman's long work and this work on brokers and translators, the second theoretical contribution of the paper is its focus on the social theorist Bourdieu, who influenced Long's actor-oriented interface analysis. For Bourdieu, human agency, so how we act in the world, is influenced by objective structures in societies, but also by internalized subjective structures. And he proposed what he called a science of dialectical relations between objective structures and the subjective dispositions within which these structures are actualized and which tend to reproduce them. And again, this is much more simple than it sounds. And he used the term habitus to refer to this learnt set of dispositions that individuals use to navigate their way in society, comprising what he calls a structured and structuring structure. But I argue that Bourdieu's thinking tools, his analytical and theoretical tools, in particular, his concepts of habitus, field, and capital, offer a way of theorizing the turn to religion by the global aid business that avoids the trap of essentializing it as either evidence of post-secular partnerships or the instrumentalization of religion. So in the first section of the paper, I argue that the turn to religion by global development and humanitarian actors has been selective and normative. So with respect to the UN, for instance, as Jeff Haynes tells us, that if faith actors want to gain entry into debates and discussions at the UN, they must accord with the UN's secular, liberal, and irreligious values. And not all faith actors can or want to do this, or even know that it's possible, and therefore are unable to directly engage in a meaningful way at the global level that impacts so many of their options. In the second section of the paper, I briefly discuss two excellent recent ethnographies that really pull out some of these tensions around faith-based organisations operating in a secular sphere and the kinds of compromises that they often have to make, particularly around things like evangelism and prayer and very explicit expression of a religious identity. So I look at Dina Freeman's new book on Tear Fund, so Tear Fund and the Quest for Faith-Based Development, and David King's book, God's Internationalists, World Vision, and the Age of Evangelical Humanitarianism. And I use these studies to examine how these international faith-based organisations navigate their place within the largely secular global development and humanitarian sphere as faith actors. And I demonstrate that the language spoken in the world of development is experienced by faith actors as what we might call a secular lexicon that can threaten what they consider to be distinctive about their faith identity and approach. But at the same time, however, they shift register between the secular development language and faith language, enabling them not only to connect with their volunteers and supporters who are receptive to a faith language, but also the local faith actors they partner with who are mostly marginalised from the global aid project. And then in the final section of the paper, I draw on recent fieldwork which examined faith actors' engagement in the consultation, negotiation, and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal framework to demonstrate the ways in which IFBOs play an important but not much recognised role as development and humanitarian agents, who again, to extend the work of Lewis and Moss, act as brokers, operating at the interfaces of different worldviews, knowledge systems, negotiating roles, relationships, and representations. Olivia, how long have I had?
About 10 minutes. You still have some time to go, you're okay.
I still have some time. So can I have the next slide, please? Would be great. Thank you. So I want to spend the sort of few minutes that I have left looking at the SDGs as an interface situation, to use Norman Long's language, which provides, again to quote from him, the means by which individuals or groups come to define their own cultural or ideological positions, vis-a-vis those espousing or typifying opposite views, as well as being the social and conceptual locations where translation occurs. So in particular, I'm interested in faith actors' engagement with the SDGs and the extent to which they engage as ostensibly secular actors, or whether there's a space for a faith dimension to emerge. So the participants in our research indicated that their awareness of and participation in the consultation to set the Sustainable Development Goal process was very low. Most had not been aware that the consultations were happening, and when they had participated, it was as civil society actors, their religious identity making little noticeable difference. As one of our interviewees who'd been involved in the final negotiations to set the SDGs told us, within the NGOs, how visible were faith groups? I'm asking myself, I honestly couldn't say that they were that visible. That's not to say they weren't there, but I have a clearer sense of the faith community, as it were, from a couple of side events which I addressed around that time. So the faith dimension was not very mainstream in the SDG, the formal SDG consultation process. Despite the strong NGO presence, however, this interviewee reported, I'm pretty certain that there wasn't a specific contribution made by anybody from a faith background. So I don't think this means to say that faith-based organisations were not in the room, and indeed I heard on several fronts that World Vision have been particularly prominent, but just that they were there as civil society actors rather than as faith actors. So World Vision explained the fact that we have a faith identity in no way excluded or created any obstacle for us being there, but I guess we were involved and around the table because we're a large international development NGO, not explicitly as a faith voice. So our faith identity shapes a lot of what we can bring to the table, but that's not the reason why we're invited to the room. Now, of course, we know that there are spaces for faith actors to own their own identity within the UN, and these were operationalised during the SDG consultation, more towards the end of it, actually, a negotiation process. So most notably the work of the Interagency Task Force for Religion and Sustainable Development. But our interviews demonstrated that overall these are siloed from the mainstream process that remains secular and are a domain within which faith actors switch from a faith to a secular register. So how does this relate to the case I'm making in this paper for an actor-oriented approach to faith engagement within the SDG domain? So in general, my research participants did not see the secular articulation of the SDGs at the global level and their involvement as ostensibly secular actors as evidence of their being instrumentalized, and they didn't feel alienated from the process. I mean, I think this is very interesting. Indeed, some viewed the commitment to secularism as an important public value where, to quote, one of the purposes of secularism is to provide a language in which people of very different metaphysical views can communicate. Nonetheless, many of the research participants were beginning to work with local faith communities to sensitize them to the SDGs. And it was at this particular interface, so working with communities not familiar with global development discourse, that the translation of the SDGs into faith-relevant language became salient. And this was particularly on issues where attitudes rooted in interpretations of religious traditions, so for instance, gender equality or interfaith dialogue, that was particularly where faith was being brought into the SDG discussion. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I tried to sort of illustrate this in a pictorial form because this is complicated, and I know that diagrams are reductive and that they don't capture absolutely everything, but I found this quite helpful in terms of mapping out what I'm particularly focusing on in this paper. So as illustrated in the diagram, the faith-based organisations who speak development language, they shift in their interactions with different actors in the SDG domain. And this diagram depicts two of the possible interfaces, or to use Bourdieu's terminology, fields. He uses this terminology of field that FBOs encounter or participate in within this domain. So these faith-based organisations engage with the Sustainable Development Goals as a secular script in their interface with donors and international NGOs, and this is interface 1, but also as a potentially sacred script in their interface with other faith actors, including local faith actors in the Global South, where the SDG framework is somewhat being reformulated in a faith language. So Bourdieu's theory of habitus, fields and capital, I argue, offers a distinct advantage for understanding contemporary religious dynamics in the public sphere, because it enables us to view society as a whole, or even the faith actor and SDG domain, as neither purely religious nor secular, but as a social world of intersecting fields within which a religious or secular habitus may or may not dominate. His theoretical framework helps interpret the experience of faith-based organisations in the SDG domain. So as depicted in figure 2, faith-based organisations move between the interfaces or fields of secular global development policy and practice and that of local faith actors, where they use religious modes of communication. And this religious mode of communication is one of the factors that marginalises these local faith actors from direct participation in global development discourses and practices. But it's also the case that these local faith actors have not acquired the capital of the secular development language. So local faith actors find that their habitus, their learned set of dispositions and their capital combination make it difficult for them to participate in global development discourses. But compared to local faith actors, the habitus and capital combination of faith-based organisations enables them to more successfully engage in the field of secular global development and to play a role as development brokers and translators. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I've discussed where I think the problem is in this bifurcation of discourses around what the turn to religion illustrates. Is it the emergence of post-secular partnerships, or are faith actors just being instrumentalized to serve neoliberal northern goals? So that's the problem. And I've looked at the conceptual frameworks that I wanted to use to interpret that, Norman Long and the literature from people like Lewis and Moss around brokering and translating. I've discussed the field work that we did on the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think illustrates this quite nicely. And also speaking to a sociology of religion audience, I demonstrate why I think Bourdieu's theory of social theory is helpful for understanding what we're seeing here, rather than social theories that force us to think about things as being either secular or either religious. So, as I said at the beginning of the paper, for people that work in this field, this knowledge is already obvious. You know, people know this, the faith-based organisations know this, the local faith actors know this, we all know this. But I think it's important to also formalise this on the page and to speak out to, for instance, an international studies audience, and to relate this to existing conceptual frameworks and theories within our fields, in order to sort of demonstrate you know, that this is significant, that this is something that we ought to be taken seriously as an academic audience. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, and very interested to hear what Kathleen has to say. And in fact, Kathleen, you were at one of the workshops where we discussed this.
I was indeed.
What a lovely synergy. I hadn't realised that directly when Olivia said that you were going to be responding to this. So it'd be great, wonderful then that you were actually at one of the workshops for the project and can give some of your perceptions on that. It's very nice to be connected with you again, Kathleen.
You too. I'm excited to catch up further.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kathleen, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I just thank you, Emma, for that. And also, I really appreciate your voice in wider respect on the subject and all the writings that you've done. And yes, so I was a participant in the SDG meeting, I think in Birmingham,
yeah,
early 2016. And just to tell folks a little bit as well, I've also worked for World Vision, and I've worked for a number of years for Tear Fund. So I read this and thought, well, hello, this is quite a connect here. I think, some of what my reflections were, I can offer from a, just an experiential perspective, and then a little bit on the research side. I worked for about 12 years for different faith-based agencies that are all along the spectrum of how they take their religious identity and then, outwork it in practice. And essentially found, Emma, that your article described very much my experience and exactly what you're saying, and articulated and put it on a page. So just to share, a couple of examples, living in the tension of between the so-called secular world and the faith world, and having to change register and to manage across a number of stakeholders with very different perspectives. So one example is recently, some of the organizations like a Tear Fund have unique challenges in this, because they have direct programming as an international faith-based agency and work with partners all along the spectrum of formality. So my last two roles with Tear Fund in South Sudan and in the Middle East, my role covered both, which was a daily translation in the organization between working with the actual explicit faith actors and then the more direct relief response. And one of the challenging things, just focusing specifically on the Syria response, is really, is an example of the exact type of thing you're talking about. That this is not a separate space where there's a secular space and a faith space, and it's certainly not an either or in the way that exactly what you're saying. We had, we're trying to use international funding, DFID, U.S. government. So we've got this highly secular language, the requirements. You have to, it's even difficult as a fluent English speaker to sometimes translate myself into that realm. And then you have the international faith-based agency, which in this case was Tear Fund. Then you're working with faith-based groups in Lebanon to respond and support partners inside Syria. And then we work very directly, if I can say this now, with churches inside Syria. And the challenge here was, trying to make the difficult decisions. For example, exactly what you're talking about, a separation of funding, let's say. So we know that the government funding will not want to work directly with churches inside Syria that may or may not be working. We can't oversee, are they working with the most needy, or are they being neutral? Another example, we had to make a difficult decision about a church in Bekaa Valley. The mission of the organization as an IFBO, the history is evangelism, is proselytization, is the desire to share in word. And we're in this church in Bekaa Valley where this church is doing that as a part of their program to respond to the refugees in the Bekaa Valley. However, we're there as representatives of this IFBO Tear Fund going, okay, some of our organization would be very pleased with what's happening here. Certainly a lot of supporters would. However, as an international agency signed up to the codes of conduct, can I as a manager continue to fund this school this church that's running a school, a Christian school, where children who are Muslim from the local camp are singing about Christ and going back home to Muslim families. And so having to make the decision, okay, in this case, which ethic do we go by? And if we do, and I'm not saying that we did, but if Tear Fund does go forward with that, certainly we use different funding. Exactly what you were talking about. And it even goes as far down as the organization's trying to register in different ways. I worked for one faith group who had a separate registration in the United States, totally different name even for the organization, so that it could access U.S. government funding. So very, very much what you're talking about. that this is a daily tension. And I think that the challenge that what you're talking about as well is that, you know, it's also a fracture within the organizations, and there's significant tension in the organization. So you almost need a translator, intermediator in the organization, and in the roles where you're over, you know, the direct humanitarian ICRC code of conduct sphere, and then the partners. I've been in meetings where some of the staff in the same organizations are kind of saying that person's not Christian enough, or this person, these are ridiculous, they're wanting to be missional. So yeah, so I mean, just 100%, it is not a distinct separate space. And I think also, though, just wanted to share from, you know, it's also a challenge, even though there's a value, and I consider an incredible privilege to try to be an intermediary at all the different levels. There's a challenge too, that, you know, you're forced into a position of actually, are you changing the mission of the faith of the groups you're working with as you try to translate back the secular principles? And I don't like that word secular principles, because they're not owned by the secular sphere. We're talking about fairness, neutrality, serving those in need. Those are not secular principles, but where they're codified. And so one partner in northern Iraq, for example, you know, you feel obliged to do these discussions and trainings on serving those in need, and, you know, these very specific terms and phrases that they need to know to be able to engage, and you need to be sure that you've taught them to be able to say that you did. You know, and we got to the end of the program, and it's like, great, so how's it going, you know, in terms of serving those in greatest need? And they said, well, great, we've got 4,240 Christians on our register, and we're serving them. And this is in northern Iraq, where the majority of the displaced people were Yazidi. And you go, okay, you know, there's, at what point do you become a secularizing force yourself as an intermediary? And again, it wasn't, I think the challenge is it's easy to segment. We're talking about FBOs relating to the secular sphere, but I think even within organizations, as I was mentioning, and specifically with Tier Fund, you know, we weren't able to get Jordan registration because though we submitted secular documents to the government, all they had to Google was World Vision's website and the marketing phrase that says, follow Jesus where the need's greatest. Well, that didn't go over, so there's no registration there. So again, I would say, at my experience down to the everyday internal or organizational experience and organizational functioning definitely resonates with what you're saying. And also, I think you raise a really good point in terms of, yes, even though they're increasing interfaces and people are saying, great, we're at the table now, the space to actually contest the ideas, I would say, is very, very minimal for faith actors at most levels, but certainly at the national and local levels. The interfaces don't happen in any formal way, and that's not true. Don't happen frequently in any formal way. Even if there's there's language, there's not a, what I mean by this, there's no, they might be at a table, let's say, let's get at a table and talk about non-food items and, you know, that sort of thing. There might be discussion on that, but there's no discussion on there's limited discussion on what aid should entail. What would those non-food items look like from a faith perspective? You know, there is increasing discussion. Oh, okay, let's make sure it's halal. But I'll just give you an example. In Yazidi population, people were distributing blue clothes initially, and blue is a color that for their culture they don't like, and because of the Ottoman Empire histories. So you know, even at the implementation level, there's very, very little opportunity for that engagement. And you talk rightly about this, you know, the emphasis on the nexus. You know, there's this more and more discussion, yeah, let's localize this to humanitarian development piece, nexus engagement, and let's, you know, bring more local actors to the table in that sense. But unfortunately, the mechanisms themselves actually exclude that from happening. just for example, one of the roles of the IFBOs is much more than just the language translation. It's helping local faith actors to be able to write proposals, to do budgets, to engage in at that level. And what happens on the ground, you talked about this, you know, in terms of them accessing, you know, negotiating resources. Here are the resources available. Not all faith actors want to do anything related to programming, but for those that do and want the resources, what happens on the ground is almost all of the decisions are made in English meetings. Even if, you know, you have, there'll be a divvying up meeting, perhaps at a UN coordination meeting or discussions like that. The local faith actors are often precluded from participation if they're not English speaking, full stop. But then I can hardly write those proposals myself, these 60-page documents, you know, with requirements that are far exceed what many populations can do. And so you have these there is great movement to bringing people to the table, but the way the decisions are made, it is highly unlikely that the local populations will be able to engage. Okay, I hear you, Olivia. So just quickly, so I think one of the things that, you know, the reason that this matters is, you know, what I'm looking at in my research is is at a different level, as well as the interface and the space allowed for the faith populations themselves, the people who are affected, to engage and influence the IFBOs and the aid, because you mentioned, Emma, that, and you're exactly right, the IFBOs, when it comes down to it, the actual aid on the ground looks almost identical to the Oxfams. And speaking of Oxfam, there is a good article, a good report that they wrote in 2017 on the engagement of faith, humanitarian development actors. And that's one of the things they shared as well, that IFBOs often don't have the literacy either to engage at that local level. So my research is looking at creating the space that is, you know, the widest space is the non-formal engagement space. And so you've got the populations daily interacting with those faith actors on the ground and non-faith actors on the ground who are trying to respond. And so what I'm trying to look at is actually quite similar, and your article is super helpful in this. I'm trying to look at, okay, you know, how in terms of effective, this not only matters for exclusion reasons, but you've mentioned it can be more effective, and perhaps actually the aid is, the recovery is better, physical, psychological recovery is better when it's faith-shaped, faith influenced, faith sensitive, because if populations have the faith logic and the faith worldview, and it connects, like you're saying, connects with the values. If it connects with the Muslim person who says, oh, that's a good point, I won't beat my wife because Muhammad would never do this, like you said in your article, there can be an incredible synergy and an incredible effectiveness there. And I want to help bring voices of the few women, the research I'm doing in Iraq, Muslim women affected by the ISIS conflict. You know, what would aid look like if it were faith-shaped for them? And so I'm trying to come out of this with evidence and information to help better understand myself. What would it be to have literacy in how I do the religious literacy and how I do the programming? How can I be changed? You know, how can we be changed as IFBOs and secular actors? Yeah, so the other thing just to mention in terms of connecting to wider literature, Alistair Ager and Anna Rowlands from the University of Durham are working on a religious literacy handbook, which I think is interesting because one of the things Oxfam mentions is to, you know, there's recommending that there actually be a religious literacy curriculum and even a toolbox. And it goes beyond just learning the lingo. It goes to much more, how do we go into situations and better understand the worldviews? How do we assess it? How do we engage in the reality that changeover of staff and a lot of people coming in and out, and that it's a complex, stressful environment? How can we do this better? So I think the handbook is in draft stage and will come out, I assume, later this year. But sorry, thanks for letting me share. Obviously, a lot of this is experiential, and I just couldn't help it because I really appreciate your article.
Thanks. I'm putting my video on too as we go into question and answers, because we are all socially distanced, but we don't have to lose sight of each other either. So if anyone else wants to do the same, I welcome you to. Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Kathleen. So we'll have time for question and answers. Please either just put your hand up or unmute, and we'll go ahead and entertain some questions for Emma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. If I can be the first one. This is Philip speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. Let me try. I hope this won't disrupt the connection. Thank you very much, Emma, for your paper, and thank you, Kathleen, for your response, which I, as a former employee of Bread for the World, the German Protestant development NGO. I'm just, apologies for not having read the full paper yet, but looking at the graph, and is it that is actually, looking at the arrows in the graph, what is it actually that goes upwards in your figure? My thesis or my hypothesis would be there's actually nothing going upwards. It's only a process of SDGs being translated downwards. So this, if we want to call a secular development concept, being translated downwards, being put in sacred wording, but there's actually none of the sacred, so to say, or religious concepts going up. It's only a matter of a downward process, and also in terms of finances, it's just a downward process. So my question would be, what is going upwards?
Hi, Philip. We've just connected this week for the first time, so it's nice to see you and hear your voice. So hi. So the arrows are indicating direction of engagement. So they're not about sort of religious values being influence the SDG process, but just that the international faith-based organisations, internationally oriented religious leaders are invited to engage at that level. So it's direction of engagement. But as the paper explains, this is all increasingly towards the idea of the SDGs being a secular script. So it's direction of engagement. But the important thing then as well is that those actors then engage with the LFAs at the local level and do that work of religious translation that isn't formally present in the SDG sphere within the at the international level.
And we have a hand raised from Jean.
Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand, so I just unmuted.
Go ahead, yes.
Shall I go ahead?
So whoever, sorry, I don't know who was speaking there.
Oh, sorry, that was Julia, and I just said I didn't know how to raise my hand, so I just putting myself in the queue.
So we'll do Julia.
Go ahead, Julia.
Yes, thanks.
Go ahead, Julia.
No, please. I didn't mean to go right after. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emma, for a very interesting framing for the world that we're all working in various aspects of. And Kathleen, your your stories and your corroboration was most interesting as well. So thank you both so much. I'm just wondering about the experience within the group of the movement of the arrows, as Philip was pointing out, from the top to the bottom, and vice versa, and whether others are seeing, as we are, something of an opening at the macro level to the religious heart-mind dialogue transformative effect, distinctive added value of faith. And whether others are seeing among donors, among multilaterals, an actual affirmative action to seek out the transformative effect of faith. We're seeing it in our work with UNICEF on an initiative, a global initiative called the Faith and Positive Change for Children, where from the social and behavior change side of UNICEF, there is a very substantial undertaking that's predicated on the recognition of the huge influence, potential positive influence of faith for systemic, holistic change for children. There's a move to think through systematically how to work much more closely between country offices and local faith actors. And perhaps others are seeing parallel plays, but I just want to add that to the mix because I think that things are, from our vantage point, I think things are beginning to change, but it'd be interesting to hear other people's point of view. Thanks.
Julia, perhaps you can ask your question as well, and we can have the general discussion around questions together.
And a warm hello to Emma. It was so nice to see you on the as the person who was presenting today. And just in full disclosure, Emma was my PhD examiner 2 years ago at the University of Kent. So it's just nice to be in touch again and continuing to read your work, which I drew on a lot in my own research. So I'm a senior fellow at the Baha'i International Community. So the work on the SDGs has something that that we've been observing and learning from and participating in for a long time. And it's really exciting to actually see more and more analysis being done on these processes. One thing that I really appreciated about your paper, both the way that you brought in Bourdieu as well as Habermas, is I think and I know you've done this in other things you've written before, but it really kind of pushes back against this kind of easy categorization and labeling. But beyond that, I think it gives us another frame and lens through which to understand what is happening. And I think part of what is happening is that we're using some maybe outmoded conceptions of religion in the labeling, because I think there's also this assumption that when religious organizations do speak in a secular register, there's some kind of like appropriation that's happening, some kind of like capitulation and watering down. Whereas I think what you're introducing here, and with like Habermas and communicative action, what we're seeing is the capacity now in the system for different registers and different systems of knowledge to be in communication with each other, but also to allow for the fact that religious organizations are continuing to evolve. So we have to allow for the fact that some of them are just not going to sound in the way that we think religions should sound. And it doesn't mean that now they've like gone rogue or gone secular, but that is the way that they speak, and it's still, authentic, and it doesn't feel like it's giving anything up, but rather that there's an evolution that's taking place, and also an evolution in the way that I think secular actors are able to communicate as well. So I just think it's helpful to think about the way you introduce like Bourdieu's thinking tools and fields, and just this idea of communicative action where the point is really not just to sort of get across packets of information, but to have like this growing understanding across what seems to be very different frames, and then allow for those ways of communicating to then like mutually influence each other across different organizations. So thank you for that. I think you're really helping the field to kind of move forward and to have these different tools for understanding these dynamics that we're seeing in the NGO world.
Thank you, Julie. I don't want to take up too much time because I know there are others that want to ask questions, but I'd just sort of say that, you know, a few years ago, I realized, I noticed that there wasn't really a sociology of religion and development, and that, you know, there was a real need for it. So I think there needs to be much more of us working on this and sort of really criticizing the usefulness of some of the tools that we have to think about religion and public life. But there are plenty of tools that exist within the study of religion, and also more widely as well within sociology and social theory, and also within the sociology and anthropology of development, that haven't been properly utilized yet to think about the role of faith actors. And the benefit of doing that, of taking those existing tools within the sociology and anthropology of development, is that we're positioning the religions and development field in the mainstream of development studies. So I think we need more of this.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks. We have a question from Richard as well. So there's a bit of discussion on the chat, but the question is very simply, under what conditions should a secular funder say we really need an FBO for this piece? And I think the discussions will maybe continue on the chat as well. I don't know, Richard, if you want to say anything about that, you can unmute.
Yes, as I said, we brought in people from the World Bank who are working in the faith-based initiative, as well as representatives from different international FBOs. And the point we were trying to get at was, since they're bidding against organizations that are clearly secular, Chemonics or DAI, on projects, was, well, what is the unique value statement for an FBO? What does it bring to the table that no one else does? And there really was no consensus. And in fact, it was very difficult to get a response. And so the only person who actually responded was the representative from Islamic Relief, who said that, similar to your story in your paper, that when you're trying to make major changes in individual behavior, in her case, it was changing to more, from traditional to more environmentally friendly fishing practices, that the imams in the community had greater moral authority when pushing for this kind of change than secular ones. So, you know, but that speaks to the local faith actors. But what would be the role of a broader-based FBO that makes it distinct from secular organizations?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question, actually. I love that question so much. And I suppose the first thing that...
Good, we put a lot of work into it.
No, it's brilliant. And I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is that actually, well, some faith-based organizations who get donor funding for projects are employed just because they do the job. You know, this is what we're told. They're employed just to do the work, just because they do the job, just like any other secular organization. So, you know, there's that side of the engagement. But I suppose now a question's coming to my mind, which I'd never sort of fully articulated before, is that we hear this all the time, don't we? That faith organizations that are funded by donors are funded because they can do the job just like secular actors. But in what ways are faith-based organizations chosen as partners? Because they are faith-based organizations as well. You know, perhaps we haven't really quite got to grips with that question. And I know I'm just repeating what you've said. And I would have said exactly what you said, that it's about individual behavior. So, you know, you see a lot of engagement with faith actors around projects to do with shifting harmful traditional practices and social norms on sexual and gender-based violence. So I think that is certainly one area. But as Kathleen was saying, organizations split themselves as well, you know, between the kind of work that they do that doesn't have a faith dimension, and where they're, you know, where World Vision competes with Oxfam for contracts, and the other aspect where maybe they do have some distinctive advantages. And I think that's why it's really important to ask these questions and to publish on it, because that's what we need to support faith actors to do, is to be able to demonstrate where they can offer something quite distinctive, and why in some situations they can be preferred partners, and why in others it doesn't matter whether it's a secular or faith actor that you work with. So I'll be really interested to hear what others have to say on that as well, but thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And Steffi is next, and then Sandra. So we'll just take those final two questions. So if you can ask them, Steffi, and then Sandra immediately, and we'll answer both questions together.
I was just going to say quickly, Richard, I'm happy to chat with you, but offline, I'd love to talk through more of what you're saying, because I do think it is a case of most of the time you're funded despite being a faith-based actor rather than because of it. But I'm super keen to talk about that. I know we're out of time, so maybe I'd love to chat with you more later.
Sure. We can exchange emails through the group.
Sounds great.
Well, I also think this could be a good topic to follow up at some point if we can find some good pointers towards this. It would be great. Sorry, I'm not wanting to interfere, Olivia and Jean, but it seems like a good topic.
Sure, we can, yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone, it's Sandra. So just very quickly, I think it would be very interesting to also discuss and to try to situate the position of bilateral organizations as well as non-faith, humanitarian agencies in this continuum or the spectrum that we see on the diagram, because I think that many of them have been also started to engage directly with the micro level, as they recognize, as we receive more evidence that faith has transformative effects on all different different issues, starting from harmful practices. I've recognized recently that even bilateral agencies such as USAID or EU, ECHO directly begins to directly engage with faith actors on the ground, for example, in Afghanistan or in Mali. But saying that, well, that's really encouraging, but I believe there is very little space for these faith actors to actually express themselves fully because of the instrumentalization of the engagement. I think that they still need to comply with humanitarian standards and all that, but very often they very inherent worldviews are marginalized and are not built upon. So if someone wants to work with bilaterals or non-faith humanitarian agencies, they need to compromise their values and to learn to speak the language the others understand, and the other parties very rarely are willing to really engage with the inherent languages that correspond to faith communities' worldviews and values. And as well, I want to point out an issue of competition between faith-based organizations, that it becomes with time just such a huge competition to gain funding and to engage with local faith communities, that in the era of limited humanitarian resources, it becomes an obstacle on a way to engage others, because normally those selective FBOs are choose to implement the agendas wherever they are. So this is my little contributions. I don't know if there's an answer to the first question I asked. What about bilaterals and non-faith agencies? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think you're entirely right. We don't have long. I think Olivia's trying to. Can I?
Well, I was going to ask Steffi, but go ahead, yes, please, and then Steffi can ask her question.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, you're entirely right, and that's another interface that could be potentially included in the diagram. But I think you made the point there that without the brokers, it's much more difficult to hear the voices in their languages of local actors, and that in that direct engagement with the macro level, they're constantly having to conform and change how they act and behave and portray themselves. So, yeah.
And last question from Steffi, because she's been holding on for a while, so please.
Okay, sorry, very quick question for Emma, which sort of goes with Jean's point earlier about the mind-heart dialogue. I was recently doing some coursework on that same body of work you're talking about around brokering, translating, the role of NGOs in doing that. And I actually thought, it came across to me as quite a worrying trend that sort of sometimes overlooked the importance of communities having ownership of their own development processes and sort of space for dialogue and mind-heart dialogue, problem solving and things like that, as most of that language is about, pre-existing outcomes, sensitizing on the SDGs, translating the SDGs. And I was just wondering whether you'd come across that tension within your research and whether you think, there's a particular danger to local faith actors in that process of sort of almost one-way translation downwards.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. In your coursework, have you been applying it to religion? I'd be really interested to hear if anyone else is doing that, or has it more been in sort of development sociology and anthropology?
I've been applying it to religion.
Oh, well, wonderful. Excellent. So I'm really, really pleased to hear that. That sounds marvellous. So that's excellent. We are growing this movement on the sociology of religion and development, which is fantastic. Yes, I think Kathleen referred to this earlier, that we've got this sort of problem emerging of almost the NGOization of the local faith actors. That they're being trained in humanitarian standards, that they're being expected to conform to the international standards, but they're then in that process potentially losing their own voice and their own distinctiveness. So I've come across it as a critique, but I don't know of any particular research on that topic that I can think of specifically, but I think it's something that we do need to look at.
And we have one last question. I keep saying last question, but we'll go for one more from Mohammed. Mohammed, please unmute if you can.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Kathleen. I will be short. Actually, I just want to raise up one point. Is like the problem is not only with faith-based organization. The problem is like we work in Syria, like around Syria. Okay, I'm Syrian. I'm a refugee myself, and also I'm working in psychosocial support. Most of the organization don't designate themselves as faith-based organization. However, most of the workers are already conservative or have like faith or like traditional faith, let's say. The problem is we feel like there's a pressure from the Western and UN terminology to use to the point that I cannot use my culture in supporting my people that I share the same values and culture and faith. This is to this point, actually. So I feel like this point needs maybe more to think about. Is like the problem is like very deep, actually, in dealing with this. It's not an organization who have missionary task, actually. So I just wanted to bring this up. Maybe later on we can elaborate on it. Thank you very much.
It's a really interesting point. Emma, you're on mute.
No, I don't have anything to add particularly. You broke up a little bit there, but I'm hoping that everyone else heard what you were saying.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that we see this again. I mean, we didn't even get into the discussion of the intricacies of how we define local faith actor, and how, as you're saying, local actors are all coming from potentially strong faith, even if it's not defining as a faith-based organization, and then how that manifests in people's work, I think will influence the way that people are applying for funding, how local actors are able to apply for funding or not, and then also their ability to represent how they truly want to do their work versus the donor requirements and restrictions which are also placed on any local and national actors applying for funding. So we are coming to the end, but there's a lot of interesting discussion going on. Thank you everyone very much for joining. I think that as we go through each month, hopefully we'll start growing on these conversations from session to session and be able to see a thread through the different discussions. Next month, we're due to hear from actually someone that Emma knows very well, Jonathan Smith, on his work. If we actually, Rima, if you can even put up that speaker note URL again, if you're interested in signing up to speak or to respond as Emma and Kathleen have done today, please just add your name to the list there, and we're back to normal next month, that it'll be 2 p.m. in the UK, 3 p.m. Central European time. We just had this daylight savings issue this month. So thank you very much everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next month. I think in the meantime, we probably need to start putting up a space on our website to kind of continue some of these discussions or have minutes from each session. So I'll go and think about that as well for the next time. Thank you very much everyone in the meantime. Have a good rest of your days.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks, Emma.
Thank you.